Welcome back to another episode of Danielle O'Terry's Italy. There's a hotel in Naples that's perfect for the night before a flight. In fact, all of the United pilots and flight attendants stay there. The hotel is pretty standard, it's part of a chain, but the building itself is the only skyscraper in Naples, which is 24 floors high. So, as a New Yorker, to me, this is funny, but also the elevator is a little anxiety-inducing because, of course, Naples is very prone to earthquakes. But all the rooms have gorgeous views, and depending on which side of the hotel you're in, you're either looking over the Bay of Naples toward elegant Posillipo, or you're facing the historic center, which I actually prefer because it's a fascinating top-down view of one of the oldest urban grids on Earth. There you can see Spaccanapoli. It's the street that cuts a straight line across the old part of town. Spaccare means to split. And the splitter is the original decumanus, the main east-west road of the Greek city. And the grid is tightly woven. It's dense. And what catches my eye from the hotel are the cloisters, these enclosed gardens adjacent to churches that are tucked right into the urban fabric. The largest cloister I can see from my hotel window is Santa Chiara. It's attached to one of the most historic and beloved churches in Naples. It's a Gothic church built when the city was ruled by the French Angevins, and it has both a monastery and a convent, which means residences for Franciscan monks and nuns called Poor Clares, and of course, they're separate. There are still a few monks and nuns in residence, but they are in a separate, smaller area and separate from the nuns' cloister garden, which today is a major tourist attraction for its beautiful majolica tile. A cloister is an enclosed garden, which comes from the Latin word claustrum, which you understand immediately if you suffer from claustrophobia, a fear of enclosed spaces. It's open to the sky, but enclosed on four sides with gardens in the interior, designed for some practicalities, but also for spiritual contemplation. Frequently, you will find a cloister designed with four paths which form a giant cross, but are also meant to evoke the four rivers of paradise. And it's worth noting that the word paradise is a Persian word which means enclosed garden. A cloister garden was a place of spiritual meditation and prayer, and also as an outdoor space, it has practical functions. So, you can imagine people doing laundry there, getting some exercise, just breathing fresh air. I recognize the cloister at Santa Chiara not just as a historian, but viscerally, because I spent 16 years working at a museum called the Cloisters in New York City. The Cloisters is the medieval branch of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it's built from pieces of actual French cloisters, as well as a full apse from a church in Spain that were all deconstructed, shipped across the Atlantic, and then reconstructed along with a lot of modern material in Upper Manhattan to feel like a Romanesque monastery. It's an entirely secular museum, but it feels like a spiritual space. I know what it feels like to spend your days inside one of these places, inside an otherwise very busy city. It's beautiful, serene, but also isolating. But I will say this, even on the loneliest days in late January when maybe only 50 visitors would come to the museum and the staff were all bored and mildly depressed and snipping at each other, and the sky was gray and the gardens dead, the space always felt privileged. For centuries, specifically in the centuries we label as the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the cloisters of monasteries and convents were teeming with monks and nuns, which today, of course, is no longer the case. And that's not necessarily due to a spiritual crisis, because most people back then did not end up in a monastery by calling. Your family put you there, and they had very specific reasons for doing so. For sons, the eldest inherited the family fortune. Younger sons could work in the family business if there was one, or go into the military or the church. Deliberately placing a son in a monastery could be piety, but it was often political. If he rose to become an abbot or a bishop, then he controlled land and networks of credit and could leverage political influence that could directly benefit the family. For daughters, the issue was a dowry. In wealthy Venice, the cost of a dowry for a merchant family quadrupled in the late 16th century. In Rome, dowries climbed steadily over the course of the 1500s. Inflation was driven by status competition between elite families. And in contrast, you could place a daughter in a convent for like 20 times less. So for a family with multiple daughters, that was an easy decision. In 16th century Florence, more than a quarter of women from elite families entered religious institutions. And in Venice, some estimates go as high as 60%. There were metaphysical motivations as well, primarily the issue of purgatory. This is a temporary state of purification and suffering for souls that aren't hellbound. But let's put it this way, they don't have the GPA to go straight to heaven. The prayers of the living, especially monastics, people devoted full time to God without any distractions or opportunities to sin, which would dilute their spiritual intensity, could shorten the time for family in heaven's waiting room. The more masses said for the soul existing in purgatory, the more prayers, the more beautiful art and music that family patronized for the glorification of God, the better. And the family members who lived in the monasteries and convent were like a stock, compounding spiritual interest over a lifetime. But also, families didn't just park their children in a cell and forget about them. They financially supported the community in which they lived and sometimes even funded private apartments. Those from lesser means did the physical labor, while the wealthier ones held power. The convent was one of the few places where women could hold power in an official capacity. On the walls of Goleto Abbey, a gorgeous ruin in the countryside near Avellino, there is a fresco of a nun named Scholastica, and you see her holding a bishop's staff, signifying that she held that level of status, that of a bishop. Goleto Abbey, by the way, is beautiful even if it was almost completely destroyed. It no longer has a roof. It's like walking around inside of an architectural skeleton in the middle of a lush meadow surrounded by rolling mountains where vineyards produce Aglianico, Falanghina, and Greco di Tufo. But I am digressing from my point that monasteries and convents were where you found the most beautiful art, architecture, and music. And they are an enormous part of Italian culture. And in one way or another, you will encounter them on your trip to Italy. Moreover, much of the art in famous museums like the Uffizi were artworks made for churches but have been displaced. And I think that if you're not already an art lover, viewing art in museums is challenging because you're totally lacking the context for which the artwork was intended. To understand why those artworks got displaced and why so many five-star hotels in Italy were once convents or monasteries, you have to understand one of the most dramatic cultural ruptures in Italian history. When Napoleon Bonaparte crossed the Alps into northern Italy in 1796, he did so with the idea that the church was an instrument of oppression, that its hoarded wealth belonged to the people, and that the monastic life was a waste of time. In Bologna, Venice, Milan, and Rome, he ordered the suppression of religious orders, and monks and nuns were expelled from their houses so the properties could be seized by the state. It's important to know that this was about 65 years before the nation of Italy that we know today was formed. So Napoleon was invading a series of kingdoms and papal states where the church held enormous power. In Bologna alone, which had a population of about 70,000 people, there were 70 convents and monasteries. Napoleon's law gave them 6 months' notice, eviction basically, and then any monastery with fewer than 15 local members was dissolved immediately. The rest were consolidated, taxed, and stripped. And the artwork was being evicted and stolen simultaneously. Tommaso Puccini, an official of the Uffizi and the Pitti Palace, secretly loaded 75 crates of Florence's most precious artworks and put them on a British ship to hide them in Sicily just to keep them out of Napoleon's hands. But Napoleon's commissars moved systematically through Italy's churches and convents and palaces. They pulled paintings off the walls, they loaded them onto wagons, and they sent them to Paris. A significant part of the Louvre was built on this confiscation. So if you visited the Louvre and have been surprised by what seems to be endless galleries of Italian Renaissance masterpieces, they are there in large part because Napoleon took them. The masterpieces that didn't go to Paris were concentrated into newly created civic museums in Italian cities. The most significant was the Pinacoteca di Brera in Milan. Napoleon called it the Italian Louvre, and it was filled almost entirely with paintings stripped from churches and convents across northern Italy and Venice in particular. The word Pinacoteca means painting gallery. The Brera doesn't have the splendor of the Louvre, and it's not on the tourist radar in the same way that the Uffizi is. But if you're visiting Milan, it's an incredible museum, and really it's a better investment of your time than visiting Leonardo's Last Supper. Also, the reason it's so hard to get tickets to see Leonardo's Last Supper is that it's in its original place, a convent, where the scene was painted on the wall of the dining room where the nuns ate. Makes sense, right? Now, Leonardo tried to paint in the fresco technique of applying pigment into a bed of wet plaster, except he was experimenting and decided to use oil paint instead of tempera. But what's on the other side of the dining room? The kitchen. And so when the kitchen heated up, the oil paint started to run, and the Last Supper has been pretty much a disaster ever since it was made. And it has been repainted many times. The actual brushstrokes of Leonardo are very, very few. And if Leonardo hadn't been so famous both in his day and after, that painting would have been long gone. But back to the Pinacoteca Brera. It shares a space with the art school, so there are always a lot of art students in the courtyard sketching. And once inside, if you took art history in college, it's just one greatest hit after the other. Because everything here was stripped out of the most beautiful, well-funded churches, convents, and monasteries across northern Italy. When you consider the extraordinary wealth of the Republic of Venice in particular, and then think about the amount of patronage that produced, you can start to appreciate why I think any art lover needs to visit the Brera. After Napoleon fell, the modern nation of Italy was formed in the 1860s, and the new secular Italian state dissolved all remaining religious orders and confiscated their properties. By the late 19th century, thousands of magnificent medieval and Renaissance buildings, built to last, set in extraordinary landscapes with thick walls, vaulted ceilings, and large communal spaces, were just rotting. And at the same time, Italy was experiencing mass immigration, mostly from the south, but not exclusively. People left Liguria and Tuscany for California and Argentina. As Italy's tourism economy grew in the 20th century, these beautiful old structures began to be used as hotels. The monks' cells were already the perfect size for guest rooms. The refectory, where the monks or the nuns had eaten in silence, was already a dining room. The wine cellar was already a wine cellar, and the cloisters were perfect courtyards. Before I share with you a few of the hotels you should know about, indulge me this one little rant, okay? I know a tour operator who has a very quiet but official no church policy on their tours. This person, like Napoleon, I guess, is strongly anti-clerical and believes their clients think churches are just boring. And I want to be clear when I say this. Whatever your personal beliefs are, I don't care. Those belong to you, and I respect them completely. But if you choose not to visit any churches during a trip to Italy, you may as well not visit Italy at all, because Catholicism is a fundamental piece of Italian culture, even today when most Italians aren't particularly religious. And I apply this idea to visiting any country where faith and religion have shaped the culture. I have covered my head to visit a mosque. I have removed my shoes to visit a Hindu temple, because any space that people have entered for centuries to be in relationship with the metaphysical world is one of the most interesting, meaningful, and potentially transformative opportunities that come with travel. To reject it would be like going to Italy and eating peanut butter and jelly sandwiches in your hotel room because you're not interested in Italian food. Okay, rant over. Let's talk about hotels. Across Italy, in any region, you will find beautiful hotels, often that have the name monastero or convento, because that's what they originally were. I have wondered to myself if occupying these spaces is a desecration, but really, no, because you know what? The wealth and the status was always there too. The most famous example is probably the San Domenico in Taormina in Sicily, which is a very swish Four Seasons property that has become very, very famous for being the set of season 2 of The White Lotus. Castel Monastero in Tuscany is very social media famous. It's a 5-star resort created from an 11th century monastery, and it delivers on every Tuscan dream there is. You've got the cypress-lined roads, the hot air balloon rides. The wine cellar has always been epic, both when it was a monastery and now. The property has been enhanced, of course, with pools. There's a spa. There's a Michelin-starred restaurant. It was run by Gordon Ramsay for several years, but the Italians didn't like him, and now they've got an Italian chef. And all of the marketing copy promises to deliver the tranquility and peace of the original monastic atmosphere. My dream hotel is the Monastero Santa Rosa on the Amalfi Coast. It's $1,500 a night for the starting place. It's on the Amalfi Coast, but it's nowhere near the water because the monks and nuns were not going swimming, first of all, but more practically, malaria was an enormous problem at lower elevations. So they built high up where the mosquitoes could not reach them. And that means they have the most incredible views. And now they have a really Instagram famous infinity pool. And the restaurant is called Il Refettorio, the refectory, where the nuns once ate together in communal silence. And it's also now a Michelin-starred restaurant. I also like to call this hotel Santa Sfogliatella. Sfogliatelle are the shell-shaped pastry that are filled with semolina and ricotta or pastry cream, and they are the signature pastry of Naples. But their origin story goes back to this specific convent. If you go to Amalfi, the town of Amalfi, you will find a pastry shop named Andrea Panza right next to the cathedral. There you can order the Santa Rosa Sfogliatella. It's filled with pastry cream and it has an amarena cherry in the center. That's the original that was said to be invented at this exact convent that was dedicated to St. Rose of Lima. Moving beyond hotels, if you want to really step into this experience and go very far off the beaten path, head inland to Padula. You'll need to drive through the Cilento National Park, one of the largest protected areas in Italy, past hilltop villages that see almost no foreign tourists. Drive is very easy, though, because the population around here is tiny and there are very, very few people on the highway. Very few Italian tailgaters. Now, along the way, you'll notice little hilltop villages that were there 700 years ago when the monastery at Padula was built. And then on the valley floor, below the actual village of Padula, you'll come to what is called the Certosa. The Certosa di San Lorenzo is the largest monastery in all of Europe. It is over 51,500 square meters. It has 320 rooms and halls and a cloister measuring 12,000 square meters. It's ringed by 84 columns. And it is magnificent. Also, unless there's a school bus parked out front, you very likely might be the only person in this enormous space. In 1306, this was not the middle of nowhere as it feels today, but a critical corridor. It was really the main overland route connecting Naples to Puglia and Calabria, and it had been an important road for centuries that the Romans called the Via Popilia. It ran straight through this valley since the 2nd century BC. So if you controlled this area, you also controlled all of the movement, the trade, the money through southern Italy. When Tommaso Sanseverino founded the Certosa di Padula in 1306, he chose the order of the Carthusian monks deliberately. They originated in France, and at the time, the French Angevins ruled from Naples. But more importantly, Carthusian monks would be able to deal with the land, which at that time was all flooded marshland. The Carthusians' engineering expertise came directly from their rule, and that was that each monk lived in complete solitude in his cell, and that required individual running water piped to every cell in every monastery that they built, which made hydraulic engineering expertise a skill they carried with them everywhere they went. So at Padula, that same expertise drained the valley floor, which was the silted bed of an ancient lake, and they turned it into some of the most productive agricultural land in the region. The result was that the Certosa became not just a spiritual institution, but an economic powerhouse. It controlled the farmland, the water, and the road traffic for the entire valley for about 5 centuries. When Napoleon's forces suppressed the Certosa in 1807, they stripped 5 centuries of that accumulated wealth. Estimates say there were about 170 paintings carted to the Royal Museum of Naples, which is called Capodimonte, while manuscripts and documents in the beautiful, extraordinary library, those were absorbed into the Neapolitan State Archives, but in a very disorganized way, and we can assume quite a lot was sold, stolen, damaged, or destroyed. After Napoleon's fall, the monks briefly returned, but with Italian unification, monastic life there ended forever. So this enormous, gorgeous structure became first a military barracks, then an orphanage for boys, and then in World War I, it was a prisoner of war camp. So what survives at Padula today is really just the architecture. Everything that was essentially too heavy or too fixed to steal. But what remains is an overwhelming peace. The fresh air, the pristine landscape, the ability to imagine what a life here was like. Quiet, contemplative, the hum of all of those monks all moving in patterns of silence. And then you go up to the village of Padula and look down at the Certosa and across the landscape and understand that you're looking at the bottom of an ancient lake that was masterfully engineered by monks 800 years ago. Also, you can have lunch in Padula. Just make sure you eat before 2 p.m. because the whole town shuts down for the afternoon and doesn't reopen until dinner time. Also, subscribers. You can visit the show notes at danielleoteri.com. There I put photos, information, including where to eat, all of the good stuff. And speaking of food, when Charles V passed through in 1535 on his way back from defeating the Ottoman fleet at Tunis, he stopped here. Not because Padula was remote, but because the Certosa was the grandest and best provisioned stopping point on the entire road through southern Italy. The monks fed his entire army, and the legend says that for the emperor's breakfast, they made a frittata with 1,000 eggs. He stayed 2 days, and every August 10th, the town of Padula still cooks an enormous frittata in the piazza to commemorate the visit. The monastery is a museum. It was formalized in the 1980s and then became a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1998, and that gives it some critical funding. There's a museum of Lucanian art there, which is not frequently open, and there's some contemporary art installed there as well, which is not great. But my favorite part to visit is the kitchen with this great stone fireplace, a copper sink, beautiful ceramic tile from Vietri sul Mare on the Amalfi Coast, and then best of all is the monumental elliptical marble staircase. It's a double helix in white stone, and it leads to the library. It was the very last addition to the monastery before Napoleonic suppression. So let's go back to Naples, where we started this episode. Naples has over 600 churches, and many of them built atop Roman and Greek temples. Remember when we started talking about Santa Chiara? The church was bombed during World War II and later rebuilt, during which time it was discovered that there was a Roman bath complex underneath, which you can visit if you go to the little museum inside the church. But I want to walk you just a short distance away to San Domenico Maggiore. It's a church we first visited in episode 4, Vittoria Colonna Had It All. It was once the most important church in Naples, and I strongly believe it should be better known today. If you remember that episode, the Aragonese kings of Naples are buried there. And after the 1980 earthquake rocked their tombs, their skeletons were studied by paleoarchaeologists that revealed something that you know what? No. You are just going to have to listen to that episode because it's incredible. At San Domenico in the 13th century, a young nobleman named Tommaso first encountered the Dominican friars. Tommaso was the youngest of 9 children. His brothers had gone into military service while he was to follow his uncle's footsteps and become the abbot of Monte Cassino, the great Benedictine monastery near the family home in Aquino. But after receiving his early education at the monastery, his family sent him to the university in Naples, and that's where he discovered the Dominicans. They were a mendicant order of poverty, wanderers, preachers in beggars' robes, and he decided that that was the life he wanted, not the cushy life of a Monte Cassino monk. His mother was furious. She had him kidnapped and held at the family castle for over a year to talk him out of it. They even hired prostitutes to try to seduce him. But it didn't work, and he began a long career between Naples, Paris, Rome, and Orvieto, writing many of the most important texts in the Catholic intellectual tradition. From 1272 to 74, the man we call St. Thomas Aquinas was given the opportunity to set up a school anywhere he wished, and he chose Naples. He lived in the monastery at San Domenico and wrote the third part of the Summa Theologica, which is a systematic attempt to reconcile faith and reason, and it insists that rigorous intellectual inquiry and deep faith are not enemies. And that is why St. Thomas Aquinas is having a remarkable moment right now. There is currently a significant wave of conversion to Catholicism underway, and much of it is coming from Silicon Valley. The engineers and philosophers and venture capitalists who are grappling with the implications of artificial intelligence are finding that the medieval church was thinking very hard about consciousness and personhood and the nature of intelligence. The Vatican has been hosting private conversations with AI leaders called the Minerva Dialogues, and St. Thomas Aquinas keeps appearing in those conversations because he asked the right questions first. You can visit the Church of San Domenico Maggiore for free, but if you pay the extra €10, you can visit the monastery and visit St. Thomas's cell. There, witnesses recorded they found him before dawn, levitating. He was suspended 3 feet off the ground in prayer before a crucifix, oblivious to everything. And then a voice reportedly came from that crucifix and asked what reward he wanted. And he said, "Nothing but you, Lord." There's also a reliquary holding a piece of bone that belonged to St. Thomas's arm, and there are pilgrims that will go there to pray in front of it. There's also the heart of somebody. We don't know who. But at one point, there were the hearts of 3 different Neapolitan kings, but they were all lost when, you guessed it, Napoleon's troops suppressed the monastery. But San Domenico, somehow today, is still active. There are just a few monks still there. They're all very old. And if you pass through the monastery to see St. Thomas's cell, and it's just before lunchtime, you might smell the pasta al forno. I really pray the monks' cells at San Domenico never become a hotel. I hope there's a renaissance of visitors that want to go see this beautiful place and it can retain its spirit and its activity. So please put it on your itinerary. Go to learn more about it, but also to feel it. I remember my friend Don saying that he didn't like to go to yoga classes at the gym, that he liked this yoga center on 14th Street in New York City because it had been a yoga studio for decades. And he said that places like that have been meditated and prayed in for a long time have a sort of patina, a peaceful vibe that facilitates the experience. The monastery cells at San Domenico have been active for 800 years. So that's why I want you to go to San Domenico. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please visit danielleoteri.com and subscribe. This kind of research, meandering thoughts, and also all of the resources that I can pull together to actually help you travel through these stories in a deep and meaningful way takes a lot of time, and your support is what makes it possible.